Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on Molinism. We are continuing our semester-long series on Ordo Salutis, Models of Salvation, as we've called it. So let me introduce for you our guest on today's program. His name is none other than Eric Hernandez. He is a dynamic evangelist and an apologist with a heart for proclaiming the gospel and defending the faith on theological and philosophical grounds. He is a sharp philosophical cookie, that's for sure. He's the author of the book, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, a simple guide for conversing with non-believers, which has been endorsed by the bigwigs, J.P. Moreland, J. Warner Wallace, Frank Turek, Mike Licona, and my friend Lee Strobel. And he's contributed a chapter to a book, Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions. Eric, my friend, it is great to see you. Thanks so much for joining me on the program today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, we have orchestrated this discussion for some time now. I know we had to change dates back and forth, but what was really important to me was that you and I would share a meal together with one of our favorite, if not our favorite, restaurant, period. And so it's none other than the Taco Bell. My man, look at that.
In heaven.
Free advertising for TB. So before we begin our discussion on Molinism, let me first ask you, what did you order for lunch today?
Mexican pizza for sure. And then burrito supreme, but I already ate the burrito supreme because one, I realized after I ordered the food, this was a bad idea because I wanted to eat it as soon as I could. Then I'm like, I don't want to eat the entire time, so I at least ate half of it. But yes, those two things.
And you couldn't, even though I said we're going to eat lunch together, you just couldn't resist. You just couldn't resist. You had to eat something before we went live together. Well, I have
go eat lunch together.
Yes, I have 3 double stack tacos. So I like to order from the value menu, and I'm really challenging myself here. I've got 3 packets of mild sauce.
Well, good job. I prefer the fire. The Diablo, they're hot, but it doesn't have enough flavor.
I see. And are those the only 3? Is it mild, hot, and Diablo?
No, mild, hot, fire, and Diablo.
Oh, mild, hot, fire, and Diablo. Okay. Let me ask you, when did you identify as a Molinist? And maybe give us a brief refresher. I know for folks that have been watching Veracity Hill now, they know I taught on it, but I brought adherents on to, in their own words, describe their views. So what's Molinism?
So in a nutshell, if someone were to ask me, like when they say, what is that? I kind of give them like, I guess like a Molinism test, which I think is pretty simple enough. Because interestingly, Thomas Flint and Craig have alluded to this, that Molinism seems to be Flint says it's the view of the proverbial man in the street. It's a view that everyone kind of already assumes. And even Molina said that he was just unpacking and making it a little more clearly things that people already held to theologically and philosophically. Okay. So I like to ask people this. I'll ask you, do you think God knows what your life would have been like had you had one more brother or sister?
I'm not sure.
Fair enough.
I'm playing hard to get, aren't I?
No, it's okay. I figured you might go there. Because most people who haven't thought of it are going to say yes, because they believe in a really powerful, perfect being.
Right.
Like some people who can't answer that question. So we'll put it this way, because I can answer both, and then we go back to the question I asked. Most people they'll say yes, and then my next question is, did God know this before He created anything? And they say yes. Well, then you have middle knowledge. And in essence, Molinism is really the idea that God possesses middle knowledge, and I'll explain that in a second, and He chose to create this world on the basis of that middle knowledge. So you also asked when I kind of first identified. Well, it was, like I said, I think everybody kind of already assumes that. But more specifically, I remember when I kind of discovered and stumbled onto, and then I later saw Craig argue this, that middle knowledge seems to be entailed by the definition of omniscience. So the definition of omniscience is simply that God knows all true propositions or statements, if you want, he knows all true propositions and doesn't believe any false ones. Well, take the proposition, and there are different types of propositions when it comes to the wording of them. So today, Eric is eating Taco Bell, and that is true, right? That's a present tense proposition. Yesterday, Eric, let's say, did not eat Taco Bell. That's true or false. It's a proposition. And any proposition that is true or false, God is going to know them. So he knows past tense, present tense, and then we can say tomorrow, Eric will eat Taco Bell. That's true or false. And because it's true or false, God must know it. And then you have what are called counterfactual propositions. So if Eric were offered Taco Bell tomorrow, then he would freely take it. Now, it's called counterfactual. One reason is because, let's say no one offers me Taco Bell tomorrow. Well, that doesn't negate the fact that if it were offered to me, I would take it. So if counterfactual propositions are true or false, and God, by definition of omniscience, must know all true propositions, then it follows he would know counterfactual propositions. And again, if God doesn't learn anything, and if we're going to set open theism aside, then God would be necessarily omniscient from eternity past. He's never had to learn anything, so he knew this logically prior to creation. Well, then, to me, there you go. You have middle knowledge. You have the core of Molinism, and then it would just make sense that God is going to create a world on the basis of what he knows, so then you just have Molinism there.
All right, there's a lot to unpack already, and I'm trying to figure out if I want to go broad. Maybe we go broad before we go narrow and deep. So God has this knowledge of counterfactuals, and this knowledge, according to you, is prior to the creative decree or the creative act. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Now,
so yeah, I can unpack that more if you want.
Well, so let me ask. So couldn't the Calvinists say the same thing? Now, you know I'm not a Calvinist, but the Calvinists could say the same thing, right?
Well, it depends. So technically, yes, they could. And this is why I make a distinction between the kind of the doctrine of Molinism and the application of Molinism. The reason now, Thomas Flint and others will say that, you know, for Molinism to be true, you need libertarian freedom and middle knowledge. I don't think so. Or you know, something around those two. I don't think so. I just think you need middle knowledge and then providence, or God's decision to create the world based on this. So to what you're saying, yes, a Calvinist can say that God, and when we talk about middle knowledge, we're talking specifically in this context about what are called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Basically, what any libertarianly free creature would do in any given circumstance. And to just kind of give more context to that, Molina broke up God's knowledge in three, what he called logical moments. These aren't temporal moments. They're logical moments. Just like the number 2 comes before the number 3 logically, not temporally, so to speak. So first you have God's natural knowledge. Essentially, God knows all possibilities, everything that's logically possible. So God knows that if I were in this situation, I could do A or I could do not A, right? But note that knowing what I could do doesn't tell God what I would do. So natural knowledge, God knows all the possibilities or every possible world, to use those terms. And then so far, everybody would agree there. Then you have, let's jump to the third one, and that's God's free knowledge. And it's called free knowledge because it's based on his free decision to actualize a specific world. We might call that foreknowledge. So Molinists, Arminians, and Calvinists all agree there on those two. God's natural knowledge, God's free knowledge. Where they may disagree would be that middle knowledge. Now, remember I said that middle knowledge, this is just like natural knowledge. In God's natural knowledge, he doesn't decide what is true or not true in that moment. Because the number 2 is even and 2 + 2 = 4. That's a necessary truth. So it's not under God's will. He can't will that to be true. Middle knowledge would be the same in that sense. That he doesn't will what is true or false in this moment. This is going to be up to free creatures. Free knowledge, now that is dependent on his will. Where the Calvinists could agree is that, yes, God has this middle knowledge. He knew what any world of free creatures would have been like, but he didn't like any of those options. So he decided to create a world in which determinism is true. And thus you have God's middle knowledge, his creation based on his middle knowledge, but you don't have people with libertarian freedom. So the Calvinists could agree there and be a Molinist. However, most Calvinists seem to have, and I say this somewhat jokingly, a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of libertarian freedom. So much so that sometimes, like Wayne Grudem in his systematic theology, which I'm not too fond of, but he basically says, anybody, I'm paraphrasing, anyone with libertarian freedom when it would be outside of God's providential control, and that's impossible. So if you had libertarian freedom, you wouldn't exist. So he's basically arguing it would be logically impossible for God to create a libertarianly free creature. So the Calvinists could deny middle knowledge by denying the possibility of the existence of libertarianly free creatures. Like, as I'm sure you've heard some Calvinists say, nothing is out of God's control, but by that they usually mean causal control. And so if they're libertarianly free creatures, that would somehow undermine God's sovereignty. Given God's sovereignty cannot be undermined, you're not going to have libertarianly free creatures, not even God's knowledge of them, because it's a logical impossibility. On the other hand, they also might throw out something like a grounding objection and say that if there were libertarianly free creatures, then it wouldn't be logically possible for God to know what they would do. So then they would deny middle knowledge on that front. So if you're going to deny middle knowledge, you're either going to have to deny, let me put it the way I think it. It seems you're going to have to deny God's omnipotence and argue he cannot do something like create libertarianly free creatures, because if that's a logical possibility, then you're denying God's omnipotence or diminishing it. And in turn, his sovereignty, which is what Molina argued about Calvin. He said, which God is more sovereign, a God who could create a world and accomplish his goal through the actions of free creatures, or a God who could only accomplish his goal by causing the actions of his creatures? And it was obviously the former for Molina. Mm-hmm. So you're going to either have to deny that or deny or diminish God's omniscience, as I would say the open theist does, where you're going to say there's something that God cannot know because there's some kind of modal thing. But that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, basically, if the Calvinists will affirm that, he can do it in the way I said it. But most Calvinists are going to have a problem with libertarian freedom, so most would deny middle knowledge for that reason.
Do you think that Arminians who hold to simple foreknowledge deny omniscience if they were to deny God's knowledge of counterfactuals?
A good question. So I think if someone's appealing to just simple foreknowledge, I think already that's a diminishing of God's omniscience for various reasons. So what is simple foreknowledge for those listening? I think it's David Hunt in the book 4 Views on Foreknowledge, where it's him, Craig, and 2 other guys. To kind of better grasp what the discussion around this, you have this idea from fatalism, which is essentially the idea, theological fatalism specifically, right? That if God knows the future, it somehow obliterates human freedom. So it seems that there's this dichotomy. You either accept that God does have foreknowledge, and then in which case you have to get rid of human freedom because you can't do something other than what God knows, is the argument. We can touch on that later. So you either have to deny God's foreknowledge or deny that we have libertarian freedom. Now, the open theist denies God's foreknowledge, and hence they preserve libertarian freedom. The Calvinists will deny libertarian freedom and hence preserve God's foreknowledge. Now, the simple foreknowledge proponent says, well, why do we need to do either of those? What if, and this is David Hunt, a most verbatim quote, he said, what if God knew the future without foreknowing it? And he basically argues if God is timeless, and this commits yourself to a brief year of time, right? Then you're going to think of like a parade. If I'm on top of a building and I look down, I can see the middle, end, and beginning of the parade. So I see what's happening. In the same way, on the simple foreknowledge view, once God creates a world, or chooses to create a world at least, he can already see what's going to happen. And so he foreknows it, but it's not future to him because he's in an eternal standpoint, and thus it doesn't cause anything. So God just seeing what we will do doesn't cause what we will do. So he can have quote unquote foreknowledge. Now, as I already alluded to, ironically, I don't think this is really foreknowledge. A lot of people, Calvinists will accuse people of, looking that God looks down the corridors of time. And then the eternity, or the Boethian view, sometimes it's called, or the eternity view, they'll say, well, no, God doesn't do that because he's timeless. Well, that would just go from looking down the corridors of time to just like looking down,
looking at time.
So you're still looking.
So you're looking, but it's not to foreknow, right? So it's just knowledge. It's not foreknowledge. Is that your critique here?
Yeah, I mean that's what Yes, in essence, it's that David Hunt admits that he says it's not he knows it without foreknowing it. Thomas Flint talks about.
So couldn't we just say that when we theologians talk about divine foreknowledge, it's a phenomenological statement. The prefix for FORE is from our perspective because we perceive time linearly.
You could say that, but I don't see why you would want to commit yourself to a B theory of time, which I wouldn't. And on top of that, even if we grant that, it still diminishes God's I would say his providence and sovereignty in many ways, and even omniscience, because on Molinism, within God's middle knowledge, it's not just middle knowledge of people who would exist, or who will exist, but even people who would never exist. So remember the question I asked you.
Yeah.
Does God know what your life would have been like had you had one more brother or sister? Now, I don't know how many siblings you have, but if one more were added, would God know what your life would have been like? I'd say yes, because that's a counterfactual, and it's going to be true or false, so God must know it by the definition of omniscience. That being said, you don't have one more brother or sister. So if we were to tally up, so to speak, the number of propositions God knows, on the simple foreknowledge view, he wouldn't know those things. Whereas on Molina's view, he does know those things. So already you have on simple foreknowledge, he's limited to only the creatures that will exist. On top of that, this strips God of any providential planning or control over the world. He just looks and sees. He didn't choose necessarily these things are going to happen. He kind of creates it and then sees, okay, let's see what comes out of it. It's almost like, I guess, kind of like, one of those mystery eggs or something that kids buy. You bought the egg, but you don't know what's inside it until you open it. So God creates the world. Then once he quote unquote opens it, then he's like, oh, this is what came about. Now, as Craig, quips, it's kind of funny because God must consider himself really lucky that he happened to create the world in which, everything happens the way, he wanted it to happen, so to speak. This also diminishes God's foreknowledge and omnipotence when it comes to prophecy. Because again, he doesn't have any control of what happens unless, of course, he directly intervenes. But then that gets into some other issues that they were maybe trying to avoid when it came to preserving libertarian freedom and foreknowledge. Now, on Molina's view, in Molinism, God knows what every free creature would do, those that will or won't exist, and on that basis can create a world that he wants, and on that basis can decide who's going to exist, who's going to freely be saved, and who's going to freely be lost. So God has control over everything that's happening. As far as, given the possible worlds that are feasible for him to create. What does that mean? If in any situation that I'm offered Taco Bell, I will say yes. Let's just suppose that's the case. Well,
yeah, then I know that's a true statement.
Well, then God couldn't create a world in which I said no, because his middle knowledge is again not up to him, but based on what I would do. So he can't create a world in which I freely do something I'm never going to do. All things being equal, right?
Yeah.
So all that to say, God has control over what's going on. He's sovereign. He's provident. You don't have to sacrifice foreknowledge. You don't have to sacrifice free will, and you don't have to sacrifice God's sovereignty, which I think all the other views are going to do in one way or another.
If the proposal were successful, of course. Now, before we get into my objections, and I understand we're going deep here for our program, and that's okay.
Really fast too.
Yes, I know, right out the gate. Let me ask you a more personal question. When did you identify as a Molinist, and what persuaded you of it?
Yesterday about 2:30 p.m. God, I don't know if I can pinpoint the exact time, but I remember hearing Craig talk about it years ago, and then like I alluded to earlier, it was just kind of looking at the definition of omniscience and thinking, well, wait a minute, if God knows all true propositions and there are counterfactual propositions, then Molinism has to be true. It's entailed by it, I would say, given that he knows all true propositions. When was that exact date? I'm not sure. But yeah, that was quite some years ago. I don't remember the exact, at least 10 plus, I'd say. Maybe a little less. I don't know. God knows.
Now, what sort of problem do you think it solves? Do you find that it solves that tension between divine sovereignty and human freedom?
Well, so that's it's funny you asked that, because I don't think it's been a while since I thought it ever was a problem to begin with. Because there's no logical contradiction to say God knows X and I will freely do X. There's no logical contradiction. Anyone who assumes there is, you have to show why it would be a logical contradiction.
Yeah.
So for some time now, I don't know what the problem's supposed to be. Now, before going into you're asking what it solves, I would say on the one hand, because I remember I was sharing, talking about Molinism to someone, and there's so many areas we can touch on as everyone can already see. And I think the person asked something like, well, what's the point, or what use does it serve me? Or, what's the point of knowing this? And I would first say that, biblically speaking, knowledge in and of itself is a good thing. Inherently, it's good to know things, especially things about God. So even if it, quote unquote, didn't solve anything, it's still good to know about God's nature, right? We want to know who God is, what his nature is like, about his attributes. Now, what it does solve, sure, it would solve the alleged tension between human freedom and foreknowledge. Though, like I said, I don't think there's any tension to begin with. That's another issue we can touch on. But I do see it has a lot of, as Craig said, is one of the most fruitful theological ideas ever conceived. It solves a lot of problems or tensions when it comes to things like, let's say, the unevangelized, or when it comes to divine hiddenness, even. A lot of areas that I don't think a lot of people realize. So just touching on divine hiddenness, that's essentially the idea that the argument, let's even go to divine hiddenness. Schellenberg made that famous. And it's basically the idea that if God is all loving and wants a relationship with me, then, I would believe because I don't resist him. So the argument is something like, if there's an all-loving God, there would be no non-resistant non-believers. Those who don't believe in God but aren't resisting him. If he were to show himself, they would believe. And then the second premise is, Schellenberg may say, well, here I am, a non-resistant non-believer. And so it must follow that God probably doesn't exist, or he just doesn't want me, or doesn't want to be in fellowship with me. Now, the Calvinists may not have a problem with that argument. But, most other Christians of different persuasions will. But note a few things about this. And without, I know we're opening a lot of worms here, can of worms. Mm-hmm. Let's say that God knows, on the one hand, let's say that God knows that someone is actually a resistant non-believer, even though they think they're not. Well, I would submit to you that the more knowledge you have or revelation you're given, the more responsibility you have to respond to that, which would also mean that the more revelation you reject, the greater your punishment or condemnation in hell. There's verses for that we can get into if you'd like, but if you just grant that we can talk about it. Then if God knows that if he gave Johnny come lately more revelation, and Johnny come lately would still reject him, and note would, this is middle knowledge here, then ironically and interestingly, it actually becomes a sign of God's grace and mercy that he would hide from Johnny come lately. Because if this Johnny got more revelation and rejected it, then he has only added to the damnation and punishment he'll receive in the afterlife. So what's interesting there is, with God's middle knowledge, we can explain hiddenness for people of those sorts. And then you can kind of see where that would go into a myriad of other things with hiddenness, but that's kind of the short answer there. The unevangelized people who never hear, what if those people who did hear...
Do you know anybody who's written a paper on how Molinism relates to the problem of the unevangelized, looking at Gregory of Nyssa's response to the fate of unbaptized infants? Do you know anybody who's written a paper on that?
I doubt it. It's such a dumb topic.
Man, it's such a niche thing. Yeah. Some idiot. Yeah.
No. Yeah, I did. Yeah. My friend Kurt Jaros, actually one of my favorite papers ever at EPS.
Really?
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Do you want to touch on that?
I'm honored. I mean, the one thing that I remember most from that experience, that was what, 3 years ago or 4? It wouldn't have been COVID year we're in 2025 now. Well, yeah. So I think it's 3 years ago. The one thing I remember most is that as I was describing Gregory's solution to the problem of the fate of unbaptized infants, there were audible gasps I don't know if you remember that. It's on the recording, the microphone that I have picked it up. Audible gasps from these professional philosophers because they realize this is like a proto-Molinism 1,000 years before Molina lived. And so, there's at least a church father that conceived of God having counterfactual knowledge. Now, whether that's middle knowledge, properly speaking, I haven't done enough reading of the church fathers to discover that, but this idea that there's counterfactual knowledge is there. And then in reading Prosper of Aquitaine, one of his letters, describing the views of the Gallic monks, he describes the Gallic monks, those so-called semi-Pelagians, as holding to this position that Gregory decades earlier describes. And Prosper objects to it. He gives the classic grounding objection. He describes it as like truths which have no reason to be true or something like that. And it's like, man, we got the grounding objection in the 5th century. So that was pretty cool. But that's more historical theology, so whether it's all true is, a whole nother matter. But I'm just fascinated with the history of it.
Yeah, like I said, even Molina said he was just laying out a little more clearly what people already believe, what the church fathers were already arguing and holding to. And he's just saying he's just making it more coherent and packaging it. So even Molina would say that while the terminology and whatnot may be original to him, the seeds of the idea were already there. No one just put them together in like a systematized way.
Mm-hmm. As I'm chewing, I'm seeing we've got some questions on YouTube here.
Okay.
The first one we'll take, it's from Idol Killer. He asks, does Eric ground the CCFs, counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, for those who don't know CCFs, does Eric ground the CCFs in the essence of agents?
No. I ground God's middle knowledge in his nature, God's knowledge of everything in his nature. So I'm glad he brings that up. Going back to, we were talking, remember, about the eternity view and how God looks and sees, and you called it phenomenological language. Well, there's actually already a word for that kind of that view of omniscience, a model of cognition, and it's called a perceptual model of cognition. So you have at least two main types of models of divine omniscience. On the perceptual view, like perception, God looks and sees, right? Now, this would be the case for open theism, and Idol Killer can correct me if I'm wrong there. I don't know if there are any that holds a different one. I don't see how they could, but open theism seems to only have the perceptual view, where God looks and sees, so to speak. And then you have, and that's also simple foreknowledge. Then you have the conceptual view of omniscience, and that is that God just knows by his very nature. He already knows the essences of everything. He knows his knowledge perfectly. And it's just by definition, he's a perfect being. So he necessarily is omnipotent, necessarily is morally perfect, and necessarily is omniscient. So whenever people bring up like the grounding objection, which is kind of what might be alluded to there, someone might ask, well, how can God know these things? How can God know these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom?
Yeah, how would God know? What was your initial question to me about how many siblings? How would God know what my life would look like if I had an extra sibling or two?
Yeah.
I mean, what makes it true that God would know these alleged truths?
Yeah. So thanks for asking. Because this is exactly what I was going to get to is those that question is so mind-boggling to me. And here's why. Imagine if an atheist asked you, but Kurt, how did God become omnipotent? What's his workout? What's his divine workout plan? And what kind of protein does he consume? What would you respond to that? Someone who asked that.
I'd say that God is immaterial and doesn't consume protein shakes.
So then how did he become omnipotent?
Well, he is. There's no becoming. He is.
Huh. Interesting. Right. So there's no ground. So what if I keep saying, well, wait a minute, there's no grounding of his omnipotence, right? That's just a silly thing to say.
Yeah.
When by definition, omnipotent is necessarily so. The same applies to omniscience. when someone asks me how God can know this, I'm like, do you not believe in the same God I do that is necessarily omniscient? So I don't see how my question would be, how could he not know these things?
Well, so
this is where someone might bring up.
Now, on omnipotence, we say we recognize logical boundaries, right? So I'll go ahead and let you, take a bite of that Mexican pizza. I mean, I've already eaten my 3 tacos. But yeah, I would say with omnipotence, we draw these logical boundaries. God cannot do illogical things. So now one option, I'm not saying this is my own view, but one option is to draw similar type of logical boundaries upon God's omniscience.
Yeah, but the problem is, I don't think omniscience is a modal term. So when we talk about modality, we're talking about logical possibilities. Mm-hmm. Omnipotence can be defined modally, but I don't think omniscience is or should. It's either you know all truths or you don't know all truths. Now, even if we grant the modality, God can only know what's logically possible.
Right.
We'd have to get an argument for that. And Craig in his newest and I know he may argue this somewhere else, but I just got his Attributes of God, his second volume to the Systematic Philosophical Theology, and he basically argues that it's based on a fallacy, the whole motivation behind it. So before going into it's similar to fatalism. So let's start there because that'll be a little bit easier. Some fatalists will say, well, if God knows that X will happen tomorrow, then X will happen. That's premise 1. Premise 2, God knows that X will happen, and then they'll say, well, therefore, necessarily X will happen. But that doesn't follow in logic. It would only follow that it will happen, not that it happens necessarily. To kind of give an abbreviated or simplified version, just because God knows something with certainty, that something certainly will happen, doesn't mean it happens necessarily. So certainty is not the same thing as necessity. Now let's apply this to those open theists who define omniscience in terms of what is logically possible to know. Someone like Hasker will argue, it's not possible for God to know something and that thing to be contingently true, right? This thing is contingently true, therefore God can't know it. It's logically impossible for God to know it, but that doesn't follow. All that would follow is if you say it's not possible for God to know something and it be contingently true, something is contingently true, therefore God can't know it. It doesn't follow, therefore it's logically impossible for God to know it. It just means God can't know it. In other words, it would still be logically possible for God to know it. It's just that the way these people have defined it is that God won't know it. God won't know things that are contingently true. But if that's the case, then you now have even on the open theist standards, you have God not knowing something that is logically possible to know. It just can't be known by God. Here's another crazy twist. Well, Jaros can know that, but God couldn't.
Well, hang on, clarifying question. Wouldn't they say it's logically impossible for that alleged truth to be known? They would just say it's not a truth. There's no truth value, right? So it's not logically possible to know.
There are different flavors or variations of the grounded objection, as you're alluding to. So another type of grounded objection is that, and this again also assumes a perceptual view of knowledge. Right. Basically, the grounded objection you're alluding to is that so truth is that which corresponds to reality. So, this thing is orange or pink, whatever. It's a little dark in here. Only if it corresponds to this reality. But Eric will eat Taco Bell tomorrow. There's no reality that exists for it to correspond to, unless you hold to, let's say, a B theory of time. So simple foreknowledge people might say, well, hey, this is where we can help out. And I'm like, no, thank you. So, there's nothing for it to correspond to. The assumption is that those things must exist for that thing to be true. But here's another one of those mini humdinger problems for people who spout these views is, well, if someone's going to say that future or counterfactual propositions can't exist because there's nothing in reality currently to ground those things, well, then they're going to have to say the same thing about past tense propositions. So in 2000 and whatever, in 2000 and the last presidential election, Joe Biden was a president. well, those things aren't true anymore, right? It's Joe Biden isn't there in the White House, or let's say the first president of the United States was George Washington. He doesn't exist anymore. So how can that past tense statement be true? Now, if someone's going to deny a past tense statement to be true because there's nothing to ground it in, that's going to seem absurd to me. But if you're going to grant that George Washington was the first president, then what's to hold you from saying the same can't be said of the future, that all that's required is that in the time that those things are described, it would, will, or has happened. So if we agree that past tense statements are true or false, even though there's nothing currently existing for them to ground them in, then the same could be said of the future as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to think more on that. And Eric, as you know, and perhaps others watching don't know, I mean, I've said that I'm open to Molinism, not yet committed to it, not persuaded by the arguments yet, but I'm open to it, and I think I'm genuine in my openness. But yeah, so it's good to learn.
Here's another thing too on.
Go ahead.
Take like mutually exclusive statements, right? Because most, if not all, openness will say that this future tense statements, or it's not logically possible to know because these statements are neither true nor false. Although there are some openness, if I'm not mistaken, that think there are knowable future truths that God doesn't know, which I don't see how you can even try to ground or say God's omniscient there. Let's say this in 2050, John either will or will not be the president. Do you think that is true or false?
Sorry, I was distracted by Adam's comment. He said, Adam Van Gorp, I'm just jumping on. How many times has Taco Bell been mentioned thus far? All right, sorry, what was your question about John being president?
Hold on, I hate when I didn't take off my Bluetooth here. 1 second. Hold on.
Ooh, I like tallest apologist. He's got a question here. I like his question.
There we go. Okay. So, let's say in 2050, John either will or will not be the president of the United States. Do you think that's true or false?
You're asking me if some fellow named John will be president in 2050?
Will or will not?
I don't know.
Note that has to be true or false because they're mutually exclusive, right?
But I don't know what will happen in 25 years.
Right, but note, I'm not asking you to know. I'm just asking either he is or he's not. Put that in one proposition. That's going to have to be true or false, right? Okay, let's put it this way.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
You're
saying, is it true that John will or will not be president? I see. So yes, so that is I would say that's a true statement.
Then automatically we see that there can be future tense true statements. But on open theism, God couldn't know whether that's true or false. And I think that's absurd.
Well, maybe because that's a logical possibility. But what would give it grounding in reality? Because that's like a mathematical, it's a propositional truth that by definition must be true. But there's nothing that corresponds to the states of affairs, right? We recognize that it has to be either one or the other.
Right, but there's no John existing, and let's say he's someone I just made up, right? They don't exist.
Yeah.
And sure, we can go there, and this is what I've heard Ben Arbour, he called the limited foreknowledge open theist view, where God has some foreknowledge, but not too much of it. But you notice the more you kind of keep pressing at this, the more, in my opinion, it gets ad hoc. And then they're having to keep making qualifications. Okay, well, maybe this one, but not that one. And maybe this one, but not that one.
Yep.
And it just seems to me, on top of all the problems we've already discussed, if God is necessarily omniscient, omnipotent, in the same way necessarily omniscient, that there's nothing that he gains and whatnot. And if there's no logical, if something's true or false, then it seems that God would know it. And if God's omniscient, then he would know all these things. And it just seems simpler to say, well, therefore he knows all true propositions. Whether we can know them or not, he does, and he knew this logically prior to his creation. It just seems that seems to be the highest view. If we're going to go with Anselm and have perfect being theology, that seems to maximize God's greatness and excellence.
I've noticed, yeah, I mean, a couple times here you've said it seems to be, but perhaps to others it doesn't seem to be that way. The seeming is, well, isn't there a funny phrase from a philosopher about seeming is believing? I wonder where I heard that.
Just because
maybe that was Planning that I heard that from. Yeah. Well, hey, we've got more comments and questions here. Let's take one more question, then we'll take a break. After the break, I've got a question from a listener viewer that I want to answer. So this question from Tallest Apologist, whose name also happens to be Kurt, is this: I've been toying with Molinism recently. Does the language of would entail a deterministic or causal relationship because God's decree and human free choices? Oh, but yeah, between God's decree and human free choices.
No. So, would is dependent on what the person would do. So if this guy, his name's Kurt, I've never met him, don't know him. If I say, hey, if you were offered $1 million, would you take it or would you not take it? Now, let's say he says, yes, I would. Well, I now have this knowledge of what he would do in a counterfactual way. And let's say the next day someone offers him $1 million and he takes it. Does my knowledge of him saying yes to that offer make him or cause him to do it? No, of course not. Well, what if I knew that 20 years ago? No. What if I knew that before he was born? No. What if God knew this logically prior to even creating him? Still, no. So no, the circumstances don't cause anything to happen. It's just God's knowing what this free creature would do.
So let me ask a follow-up here. And after the break, I'll also ask Cosmic Skeptic's question about principle of alternative possibilities. But to Tallest Apologist's question, your answer: doesn't God's quote-unquote logical, quote-unquote deliberation of feasible worlds, isn't that part of the overall process? So God determines which feasible world to actualize, such that there could be a world in which you don't do X and God has determined you to do Y because God has chosen to actualize that world. So there is a sense of determinism.
Are you asking me or clarifying this question?
No, I'm asking you. Yeah. Isn't God's quote unquote deliberative act deterministic of the world that will be actualized?
Well, first I wouldn't use deliberation to talk about God's knowledge.
That's why I put
I think I know what you mean.
I put it in quotes,
Sure. Fair enough. No. So if I guess I don't see why it would. Now, what it sounds like you're saying, I think if I understand you correctly, this question would only make the same mistake that the fatalist does. If God knows it, it's going to happen necessarily. That's for future stuff. But if God knows counterfactual stuff, if we agree that God knowing it doesn't cause it for future tense propositions, then the same would apply to counterfactual. If God's knowledge of my future doesn't cause my future, well, then why would God's knowledge of my counterfactual choices cause my counterfactual choices?
I'll have to think more on that.
And if you want to go even more with that, now what you might be getting at, which some have also argued, is, well, it's almost like, let's say, God's setting me up, so to speak, right? Or a sting operation or whatever,
right,
as I've heard Craig call. Well, again, no, because one, God, it's not as if God is causing the situation, and this is where Molinists may make the language. I'm not too fond of it, but I use it if I need to. Strong actualizing or weakly actualizing. To strongly actualize is like, let's say, like Calvinism, right? Causal determinism. God causes, A to cause B and whatnot. But weakly actualizing is just God setting up a state of affairs, knowing what would happen. So, right, kind of like a sting operation where, let's say, they're trying to catch this drug dealer, and so an undercover cop, offers
pretends to be a drug dealer, yes, does these illegal things, but he does it under the cover of wearing the badge in order to entice or even provoke a person to commit a crime.
Well, and there might be a line on, where, you are, if you're like begging the guy, come on, please buy this and, whatnot, and the guy's just being generous. But if, let's say, they just think you're a drug dealer and you're not enticing them or anything like that, but they think you have drugs and go ask you,
right?
Well, you could still arrest them because you're not causing it. And you simply knowing what they would do, does it, again, make them do whatever it is that they're doing. Now, on top of that, though, note that God isn't necessarily causing even the circumstances in that strong sense. God creates a world knowing what free creatures would do. And let's say, so when I propose to my wife, I like to use this example, and obviously it's a limited example because I'm not God. But when I proposed to my wife, I determined what we would eat and where we would be. It was like a 4-hour dinner cruise. I even bought her outfit, her shoes, her jewelry. Everything was on a time schedule.
You just stop there. Let me applaud you for knowing how to buy clothes for your woman. I mean, you got some life skills right there, man. So good job.
Let me move the halo from my head. I asked my mother-in-law. She helped me with that. So I didn't want to screw it up. So I basically set up the circumstance, if you will, even to the very song that would be playing by the DJ when I dropped on.
Boy, it almost sounds like manipulation, right?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. But knowing what she liked and I knew, I already knew she'd say yes. And knowing also, what her, what she liked or how to do it, so to speak. That didn't cause her to say yes, because I also knew it would have taken for her to say no. I could have called her a dirty word, spit on her face, and then threw her over the boat and say, hey, would you marry me, by the way? Of course, I think she'd say no.
Right.
So me knowing what it would take for her to do that doesn't cause her to do it. But now let's bring God back into the picture. I set up the circumstances in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Or did God set up the circumstance or situation? Well, in the quote-unquote weak sense, he created me knowing I would set up those circumstances and just use those circumstances. So, one, I'm the first cause of this thing happening, and God is free in his sovereignty and who he is. He's free to use my free actions to still accomplish what he wants. So, again, everything that is happening in these situations are done by free creatures, and it's God's prerogative to use what they do and the circumstances they create to bring about what he wants.
I'll think more on it, but what I do know, not just counterfactually, but what I know about this program is that we should take a break. When we come from the break, I'm going to read Logan's question, which he submitted through the veracityhill.com website. And again, if you were to submit a question through the Veracity Hill website, I will read your comment or question through the program every week that it happens. So thank you, Logan. We'll get to your question, and we'll continue our conversation with Eric, answering YouTube questions after this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill with Dr. Kurt Jaros.
In a world full of roller coasters, one ride has a dark secret. Gabby Goes to Ludicrous, the first adventure of Doorway, a new series for young travelers.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
You're listening to Veracity Hill with Dr. Kurt Jaros.
Well, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you want to learn how you can become a sponsor of the program, just contact me at veracityhill.com. Well, speaking of that website, as I've already mentioned, we've got a question from a listener or viewer named Logan. And he says this: "Hello, Dr. J. Really enjoy your channel and content." Literally, folks, I'm not making it up. That's what he wrote, okay? Really enjoy your channel and content. Your demeanor is so refreshing. And yes, you do naturally smile when you talk, which is a great trait. I have been wrestling with free will and determinism and wanted your take on passages like Genesis 50:20 and Acts 4:28. It seems like God was the active cause in the sinful actions of Joseph's brothers and those who crucified Jesus. Specifically on the crucifixion, if God predetermined it, then doesn't that guarantee that someone has to sin in that instance? Thank you. Well, so Eric, as the resident Molinist here, you already have your resolution for how God brought those two things about, the selling of Joseph into slavery or God orchestrating the crucifixion of Jesus. So maybe, Eric, I'll toss it to you, then I'll bring it back to me. How would you say to Logan's question, doesn't that guarantee that someone has to sin in that instance?
No, doesn't guarantee. And when he says, just to clarify, doesn't that, what is a that he's referring to?
Doesn't that, specifically on the crucifixion, if God predetermined it, then doesn't that guarantee that someone has to sin in that instance? So maybe that refers to predetermination.
Right. So what does predetermination mean? Right. Unfortunately, some people think Calvinists own certain biblical words, like election or predestination
or dead,
like
or in. Yeah.
Right. I was talking to a Calvinist once, and I said, he asked me why I was a Molinist, and I said, well, no. First, I asked him why he's a Calvinist, and he said, well, because I believe in Scripture and God's sovereignty and in predestination. I was like, you can't just, those aren't your words. I say, okay, ask me while I'm a Molinist. He said, why are you a Molinist? I said, because I believe in the Bible, predestination, God's sovereignty, and, election, whatever.
Yeah.
In other words, they're not one view owns those words, so to speak. So to predestine means to just essentially choose beforehand. And if God has middle knowledge and knows what everyone would do in any circumstance, then he can choose beforehand which world to create, knowing what free creatures would do. So if God's predestining in that sense, there's no causation happening. Everyone still has libertarian free will. They're the first movers of their actions, and God, just knowing what they would do, could create a world in which they do that very thing.
Okay, so that's your answer for Logan. It doesn't guarantee. So you mean you interpret his use.
It would guarantee it.
Oh, okay.
It would guarantee it.
It would guarantee that someone's sin.
Oh, well, okay. I thought you meant the outcome. Does it guarantee someone's sins? No. Sorry, it muted. Assuming he's talking about prophecy, is that right?
No, this is about the crucifixion of Jesus being orchestrated by God and the Joseph being sold into slavery being orchestrated by God.
Yeah, does that that's kind of what I'm getting at, is if God's orchestrating it, he's orchestrating in the sense that he knows what people would freely do. Does it guarantee someone would sin? No, but the fact that someone is going to sin, God can use someone's sinful choices and orchestrate using their sinful choices to orchestrate something good coming out of that. So Scripture says that, what they intended for evil, God meant for good. Just like, again, someone's sting operation, or let's put it this way, there have been cases, I'm sure, where someone hires a hitman on their wife. Well, thank God that the quote unquote hitman they hired was an undercover cop.
Mm.
Well, or even people, I don't want to get this, video demonetized, but even people catching, let's say, certain kind of predators, if you will.
Right.
There's people, vigilantes, who just make an account on certain websites, talk to these predators, and kind of puts them on video. Now, are they causing any of that? No. Does them making an account guarantee someone is going to go after the vulnerable, if you will? No. But knowing that these people are already doing that, they are setting up a circumstance in which they can be the ones to catch them, as opposed to a vulnerable person who, might get caught up in something really, really horrible. So again, if God knows someone's going to sin, then he's not the one guaranteeing they sin. They are guaranteeing that they will sin. God, knowing this, can use that to bring about something good.
So let me, before I answer Logan's question with how I would answer it, let me employ cosmic skeptic. I don't know if you've encountered this gentleman, Eric, but it's not cosmic skeptic, Alex O'Connor. This is cosmic skeptic. I'll leave it at that. So his earlier question about the principle of alternative possibilities, you talk about the sting operation or the predator catching a pedo online. The question about PAP here, let me find it again. I've lost it through here. Oh, we've had a lot of comments. Question for Eric. Under Molinism, do you have access to the principle of alternative possibilities? If not, how does libertarian free will work without it in your view? So I guess in light of like the predator, does the pedo still have the now that might be a weak analogy, because the predator, it's too weak of an analogy. God knows what you would do on Molinism. God knows what you would do in circumstance C. So does the principle, is there an alternative possibility for person A in C? Is it viable? Is the alternative possibility viable or not?
Yes. Yeah. So this is essentially a more sophisticated version of what I've already said. I don't see why people think there's a tension to begin with.
Okay.
God knows what I will do, and I will freely do it. There is no inherent or explicit logical friction or tension or incompatibility there. That God knows what I will do, and I freely do it. You just take those two statements. There's no logical contradiction. Now, what the person is asking is basically that, because I can put it this way: in circumstances C, I will do X, but I could have done Y. Make that one proposition. That could be true even if I never do Y. So do I still have the ability to do something different when circumstances C arise? Yes, I just won't do it. So I don't, this has always been mind-boggling to me, because I don't see why it's a problem. Now, people might say, yeah, but you're not going to do Y. Yeah, I know I'm not going to do Y, but I still could if I wanted to in this situation. I just didn't want to. So nothing about what I will do removes the fact that, I can't do something else. This might help people in general. And you see how the future and counterfactuals are, they kind of, any argument against one could be used as an argument against the other, essentially. So let's put it this way. Here's another way people have argued this. They'll say, going back to, if God knows I'm going to mow the lawn tomorrow, then I have to do it. I can't do otherwise, right? So it moves that dual ability, that alternative possibility. Otherwise, that could be wrong. Well, note how, if that's the case, that would apply to anybody's knowledge, anyone's knowledge. So if I know that Kurt's going to mow the grass tomorrow, well, knowledge by definition is going to be at least a justified true belief. So if I know you will cut the grass tomorrow, and that entails that my belief you'll cut the grass tomorrow is true, then guess what? You're going to cut the grass tomorrow. But did I cause you to do that? No.
Well, maybe you don't know that I'm going to cut the grass tomorrow. Maybe you just believe that I will cut the grass tomorrow.
Okay, right. And then we would argue, well, what is knowledge, right? And without going to that, I don't see why I couldn't know. What would prevent me, other than an open theist or someone in those camps wanting to deny me for knowledge, so to speak? So yeah, again, if I know, because really justified true belief. I believe something, I'm justified in believing it. If I know you're going to do it, then it's going to happen. Just because God knows it or I know it doesn't make a difference as to whether or not it's going to happen. This is essentially, again, fatalism. For the fatalist, if there are true propositions of the future, then it's fated necessarily going to happen. Theological fatalism just has God. Now put those propositions in God's mind. Same thing. But I don't see how a statement in the future being true or false somehow removes my free ability to do something else if I wanted to, or that I could do something else. And the last thing I'll say is I don't think the principle of alternative possibilities is necessary for libertarian freedom. I think it's sufficient, but not necessary. I think the only thing that's necessary is that you are the first mover of your will. If you're the first mover, all bets are off. You have libertarian freedom. If I can't do otherwise, that's okay. As long as I am the first mover, then I have libertarian freedom. And of course, if you have principle of alternative possibilities, dual ability, and I can do otherwise, then I have libertarian freedom. But that would be sufficient, not necessary.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Let me repeat Logan's question, then I'll answer. Just for those who are, we're already down the rabbit hole so much. I want to bring it back here to Logan's question. Let's see here. He compliments me. I won't have to repeat that. I have been wrestling with free will and determinism and wanted your take on passages like Genesis 50:20 and Acts 4:28. It seems like God was the active cause in the sinful actions of Joseph's brothers and those who crucified Jesus, specifically on the crucifixion. If God predetermined it, then doesn't that guarantee that someone has to sin in that instance? Thank you. Logan, great question. The one thing that I would say about these particular verses and about the Calvinism, Arminianism, and other ism debate is this. These two verses do not describe how God acts in every meticulous circumstance throughout the course of human history. It simply describes a couple instances and a couple important instances which pertain to the Historia Salutis, the history of salvation. So yes, God has determined some things that would happen. It doesn't mean that God has determined all things to happen. That's really important because in my experience, I've encountered Calvinists who will employ these passages. You've perhaps heard some of them. I think maybe Chris Date employed the Genesis 50:20 passage. You'll hear Calvinists employ these passages and use this as evidence of the divine eternal decree where God has orchestrated and ordained whatsoever comes to pass. I would push hard against that and say, no, these verses simply describe a couple things that God has orchestrated or determined for the sake of the history of salvation. So we know what happens with Joseph. He goes into a position of leadership. He's able to, through his leadership, get through a famine period for the people. The people are saved. Abraham's offspring are saved through Joseph's political and economic decisions. And throughout the course of the centuries, through the creation of the line of David, through the line of David to Jesus. This is about God orchestrating a particular state of affair, not about orchestrating everything that were to ever possibly happen. So, big difference there on that question. So, now
I don't know if you answered this question, Kurt, if I can jump in here.
Yeah, which I was just about to address on the
specifically.
guarantee. Yeah.
Oh.
Is that what you're going to point to, Eric?
Gotcha. Well, yeah, because I think it was talking about this specific. In other words, it sounds like you're saying, and maybe you're about to clarify that no, not always, but in this one, yes, he did.
Yeah, I think we can swallow that pill without having to embrace Calvinism, or well, I guess Arminians might be fine with that as well. It depends on your type of Arminian. So yes, I think one could swallow that pill, and yet it doesn't mean what some people want it to mean, if that makes sense. So it's like this.
Yeah. Okay.
The way I would see this is, if I were to give an analogy, imagine two people playing chess, and one person playing white corners black in such a way that white knows black only has a few options. And so white knows the outcome regardless of what black will play. And so white will get checkmate in, say, 14 moves. You know, some of these, grandmasters, they're so far ahead thinking of the move count. So no matter what black does, white has black pinned. White will win. I think in cases, at least a few cases, the biblical data does suggest something like this, where there are certain outcomes that God knows will happen if he were to providentially orchestrate the world in a particular way. Providentially orchestrate, I won't even say the world, a subset of human affairs. If God providentially orchestrates a subset of human affairs, that certain particular outcomes will come about. Now, I will also say this, that when this happens, this is not God determining people's eternal destiny either. So, again, this is where the Calvinist wants to use these passages and make it lead to Calvinism. It just doesn't. It doesn't. They would be reading into these passages far more than what the passages intend to communicate. So that would be my answer on that. So God knows.
Can I clarify what you're saying?
Yes, but in 1 second, my friend. God knows that Pharaoh will harden his heart if God does X, Y, and Z. God does X, Y, and Z knowing that Pharaoh will harden his heart. So, yes, does that mean Pharaoh sins? Pharaoh chooses to sin. I don't think that means that God forces or coerces the person. So you might say, boy, that sounds like Eric. Well, as I said, I've said I'm open to Molinism. I'm not persuaded by the arguments yet, but nor do I think what I'm explaining here also entails Molinism. You might have some, robust sense of divine providence and God orchestrates the subset of affairs. But okay, go ahead, Eric.
And the reason I just say clarify, because I guess initially, and this might be my fault, what they say about people who assume, I thought by guarantee he was thinking call to determination. And it sounds like that you weren't thinking that at all. In your answer, you're just asking, does it guarantee someone will sin, leaving aside whether or not that's causally determined, right?
Yeah, the way I interpret guarantee, just rather does it make it certain? Is it certain that someone has to sin in that instance? That's how I interpret Logan's question. But Logan is, of course, welcome to clarify if he were to use the veracityhill.com website.
Yeah, and so, yeah, I'm good with your answer. Not that you needed my approval, of course. But yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it sounds like what I would say. And yes, that guaranteeing or making something certain doesn't mean it happens necessarily. Without going to this rabbit trail, there could be a possibility where they're not sinning, but it guarantees an action. But let's not go there. Nevertheless, note though, why does the crucifixion have to happen? Well, because mankind sinned. So we can even go all the way back and say, well, the only reason God had to guarantee the crucifixion is because someone else guaranteed that human beings are going to sin, namely human beings themselves. So ultimately, God is responding to what humans have done freely and yet still wants to save them. So even if, so we can say guarantee. Now, back to guarantee because someone else guaranteed they're going to freely sin. So again, God is using their sinful choices to bring about something good, just like in Genesis and everything else we talked about. On the other hand, if we're going to use cultural determination, which neither you or I hold to, then of course that has huge implications to God's moral perfection. Nevertheless, I like that you were strong on providence here. And I guess, and you don't have to answer, but my question would be then, why not apply that, though, to everything God does? Then you have Molinism and a high view of providence.
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah. So on the biblical data, I mean, as a theologian, I don't see, and I know you and I are going to disagree on this, but I don't see enough evidence to suggest that this is, in fact, how God operates, that these particular instances, it's always the case for every state of human affairs. But rather, I just see it as a subset of human affairs. So I don't think the biblical data supports a full-fledged or exhaustive providence. Maybe we could call, is that an okay term, exhaustive providence? I don't.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah, so I don't know, you said why not apply it, again, I just don't see that the scripture teaches that. So that would be my first response. And then, yes, I do have some philosophical concerns. Now, I'll have to think more about them. I'm not a philosopher professionally. You are sharper than I am, so I've got to think more deeply about these things. I've raised some of my objections, though, throughout our conversation, and I'll have to probably review the video at some point and think more on it. But so for me, my own concern with Molinism is that I think there's a seeming here, right? Seeming is believing. There's a seeming to me that God's quote unquote deliberation of the worlds to actualize. Now, your response to that was, well, this is it's that modal fallacy. So I'll have to think more on it. Am I having a lapse in my logical thinking? Perhaps I am. I'm a fallen human, so I'll have to think more on that. But it just seems a little too deterministic for me. Does it retain a sufficient amount of libertarian free will? Notice how I clarify that, and this isn't a problem you make, Eric, but I'm not opposed to some things being determined, because I don't think humans always have to be libertarianly free in all circumstances.
Right?
We just have to be a certain amount, a sufficient amount free for human responsibility. So yeah, so that's why I'm like this weird guy where I'm like, I'm definitely not a Calvinist. Arminianism doesn't appeal to me. Not persuaded by Molinism, but here I am talking about like this strong sense of providence, and maybe we're more determined, but I have a robust sense of human free will. I'm this weird egg in a batch of theologians and philosophers. So I've got these philosophical objections. So between the scriptural and philosophical ones, like I said, I'm not yet persuaded by it, but very much open. So I'll have to do more reading and thinking after I write the other books I want to write.
Open theist open?
No, not an open theist. God has. I would presently identify as a simple foreknowledge, in the simple foreknowledge camp. So don't currently identify as an open theist, and I don't think I'm open to it. I'd have to. I mean, I'm open to all views in a sense, like logically. Yeah, it's logically possible I'll become a Calvinist, right? But so open theism is more than the Calvinism, but the Molinism, like, yeah, it seems like there's a meaningful difference in terms of my openness to Molinism. So I'll have to think more about that. Sure. But we've got people commenting and questioning. We've had a dozen or so people watching live with us here today, and let me see, because there have been some comments coming in. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Cosmic Septic asks, question for Dr. J. Does holding to the doctrine of divine simplicity have implications for how you would have to handle Molinism? Well, I haven't studied in depth divine simplicity and all that, so I'm honestly not comfortable answering that sort of question. So I'd really have to brush up. The last time I was reading material on that was probably like 15 years ago in my earlier days of grad school. It's just not one of my areas of expertise. I like talking more about the Ordo Salutis issues. He follows up by saying simple foreknowledge is so basic. Yes, it is. It is a basic view, but there are complexities, like how does a simple foreknowledge person ground counterfactuals? Because the biblical data does present some counterfactual statements. So how is it that we are to interpret those? That's a good question. All right, let me see here. There was another question for you, Eric. Let me scroll up and see if I can find it. Here's a question from Free Thinking Ministries earlier. Wait, why weren't we invited to this Molinism party? Yes, Tim or Josh, I'm not sure which one was commenting at the time, but yes, I know you guys are big time Molinists. I wanted to eat Taco Bell with my buddy Eric, and I know he's a Molinist, so extended the hand there. We could do it another time, of course. Eric, do you know if Tim is a big Taco Bell guy?
I don't think so, because I remember one time we were in Utah, leading a Maven trip, and he's like, oh, this is the first time I've eaten this, or I haven't eaten this in a while, and so I was like, what? So he may be a little sheltered when it comes to the Taco Bell camp, but when he's around me, he freely eats Taco Bell. There's a counterfactual there.
Yeah, Yeah. All right. I thought there was another question, but I'm perhaps not seeing it. We've got other folks commenting. And of course, Free Thinking Ministries comments, Kurt's a Molinist that has yet to admit it. Well, I mean, that wouldn't be the first time. Leighton Flowers a few weeks ago accused me of being a provisionist without identifying as one, but I gave reasons for why I don't identify as a provisionist. So the labels, they're tricky. They're tricky. You know, what do people mean with certain terms and words? That's so important. Eric, let me ask you, as we continue our conversation, what do you think are the weaknesses of Molinism? And you have to come up with something. You can't just say, like, it's too biblical and therefore it's weak.
Well, let me give something along those lines. That's not I don't think it's a cop out, and then I'll give something else. The fact that it can get really technical really fast. So it's deeply philosophical. That can be a weakness, not necessarily to the truth of the view, but to the reception of other people holding to it. You know, even Leighton would say, he said it publicly, and he's told me privately too, so it's no secret, but he'll say, like, well, no, he just kind of leaves it to the philosophers. He's more a theologian. He one time said, and then plus, if I affirm Molinism publicly, then I have to defend it. I'm not smart enough philosophically to defend it. But yeah, so it can push people away, quote unquote, for that reason. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, this seems to be the view of the average person. Everyone seems to live their lives as if, let me stop saying seeming, because like I said earlier, that's me being modest. I see that everyone lives their lives based on the fact that there are true or false counterfactuals, whether it's what to do, what to wear, what to say, what to eat, and counterfactuals regarding the choices of free creatures. No, I'm not going to do that, because if I do, my wife will get mad at me, or if I don't do this, and my boss will fill in the blank, or whatever the case is. So we all intuitively have this notion that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and it's only until we talk about God and our own views are on the line that we start second guessing that, that we start having some hesitation, it seems. So yeah, while it can be too philosophical, I will also say at the same time, it seems to be the view that everyone just kind of already hold. I can't tell you how many people I've explained Molinism to, and they're like, oh, I've always believed that. The other thing, the quote unquote, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so let me give some pushback if I can, or devil's advocate. What you're recognizing that people have as this belief of the truth of counterfactuals, that's distinct than from middle knowledge. I mean, because perhaps there's some other way that we could ground God's knowledge of counterfactuals, which is not middle knowledge. Is that correct?
Well, if you do, it depends how you try to do that, because the way it's historically been done without it being middle knowledge, it would just remove human freedom, where God decides the counterfactuals.
Okay.
So remember I said natural knowledge is independent of God's will. It's pre-volitional knowledge. Before he decides to do anything, he knows all necessary truths, right? He doesn't will them to be true. Same thing with middle knowledge. It's pre-volitional. He doesn't will what Kurt's going to do in circumstance C. You were the one that decides that. Now, if you're going to place counterfactual knowledge and make it post-volitional, which would be part of his natural knowledge, well, now it's God deciding what you would do, and hence it's not a counterfactual of creaturely freedom, it's just counterfactual. But there's no creaturely freedom there because it's post-volitional. Make sense?
I think so, but I'll have to think more on it. That's always my let's get out of here maneuver. I'll think more on it.
Okay, sure thing. So yeah, that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I could almost see people trying to Calvinist clipping this or something. There's technically, you can't point to a proof text for knowledge. While there are, I think, sufficient proof texts for God's knowledge of counterfactuals, someone who holds to something like simple foreknowledge could say, well, God just knows that person so well, he knows what they would do, right? And then kind of like what Idol Killer was asking, it's kind of grounded in God's knowledge of that creature's essence, or what that, like I could say I have counterfactual knowledge of my wife because I know her so well by this point. I know that if I offered her, this food over this food, I know which one she would take. So I have counterfactual knowledge. Now, there's lots of that in Scripture of God having counterfactual knowledge. But for it to count as middle knowledge, it has to be logically prior to his decision to create anything. And there just aren't many verses that talk about what God does logically prior to creation. Now, no, I'm not saying that it's unbiblical or something. I'm saying when we're talking about middle knowledge, we're getting into an area that the Bible just doesn't address.
Yeah.
God's knowledge logically prior to divine decree. Nevertheless, there is sufficient data to say God knows all truths biblically. And if God knows all truths, and this is the argument I made in the beginning, God knows all truths, and there are counterfactual truths, and God knows all these things inherently, necessarily by his nature, on a conceptualist model, not a perceptual. He's not looking. Well, then God knows these things logically prior to the decree. So this would be an issue that is settled systematically with theology and philosophy. Does God know all truths? Yes. Does he necessarily know them? Yes, logically prior to the decree. So the weakness there would be you can't point to a proof text, so to speak, for middle knowledge, though you can point to one for counterfactual knowledge.
Correct. I think I'm in agreement with you on how you describe that. So, yeah, it's an intriguing subject for sure, and this is not a novel idea. It's been around for centuries, even longer than what the Molinists have realized, at least about God's counterfactual knowledge. So that's what, got me intrigued back years ago when I stumbled across, well, I initially learned about Molinism in my let's see, it was probably philosophy days of my undergraduate studies. But then it got me really interested when I stumbled across it doing my doctoral work on the Gallic monks. That was quite the surprise for me. So that's why I thought, hey, I got to write a paper on this and read it at the EPS annual conference. So yes, that was a lot of fun. Eric, I want to thank you. I'm sure we could keep talking about it, and there's more comments from the live chat, but I won't be able to address all those. We've already gone 90 minutes in this conversation, so I want to thank you for your time. How can people find out more about your work in ministry?
They can go on my YouTube channel. Just Eric Hernandez, type that in YouTube. TexasApologetics.org. When we do our conferences, we have one coming up in October. And then I have some stuff on my website, erichernandezministry.com, but I haven't kept up with that just because, I started doing that when I was just kind of by myself doing ministry. Then I've been with Texas Baptist for the past 6 or 7 years, so I haven't needed to necessarily keep up with that. So any of the other things I mentioned would be fine.
Great. Well, hey, stick with us. I want to chat with you afterward, but I'm going to sign off here in a moment here.